This is an existential period for healthcare. Access is a huge worry for us. If in fact reimbursement thresholds change dramatically and rural and community hospitals begin to close, where are these patients going to go? How are they going to access care?
Mm-hmm.
Drug discovery, device, regulatory approvals, cures. These things, entities are pencils down right now, Ty, as you know. So we've got to get to some rational level of response in terms of at least keeping the machine fired. But we're not sitting idly. We are delineating and quantifying all of the things that we think we might need to have to do, depending on the size of the reaction that we need to address. Most systems are doing the same. Some systems have huge, endowment pools where they have a different risk tolerance. We find ourselves in a position where doing nothing and hoping is not going to be a strategy. So we do have to position and prepare ourselves.
Hey everyone, this is Ty with the medDesign podcast, where we hear compelling stories from medical innovators who are making an impact on healthcare. We're about to talk to David Sylvan. He's the Chief Strategy, Innovation, and Marketing Officer for University Hospitals. He leads transformation and innovation efforts through UH Ventures. He's fostered innovation over 400 invention disclosures, more than 500 patents, 60 plus licenses, and while concurrently supporting a portfolio of 20 plus companies. He established the Office of Strategy and Innovation to streamline enterprise priorities, and he's resulted in 20, quote, vivid visions guiding clinical departments. I'm going to make sure to ask him about what a vivid vision is. Under his leadership, the system has exceeded Cleveland Innovation District job creation targets by 80%. And launched programs like the Fjord Accelerator to advance ideation, commercialization, and innovation culture. He's been recognized by Fortune as one of America's most innovative companies for 2023. This system has been positioned as a leader in healthcare transformation. Mr. Sylvan also oversees strategic marketing, turning it into a data-driven, revenue-generating function, and manages high-profile partnerships with organizations like the Cleveland Browns and Playhouse Square. He's also an adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve University. Mr. Sylvan mentors future leaders while contributing thought leadership at industry forums. Please stay tuned. This is going to be a really impactful conversation. All right, David, thank you so much for joining me on the medDesign podcast.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Oh, very good. So let's start with your title, Chief Strategy, Innovation, and Marketing Officer. Could you just take a minute to say, how did you manage to take all the fun jobs at university hospitals?
But I do acknowledge, Ty, that I'm honored and privileged to have the roles and the responsibilities. And I think for me, the beauty is to be able to meld teams and groups that invariably tended to live in their own silos and sort of blur the lines between all three, using this notion of the focus on the human data and insights is that common thread and that common language. But, I think the genesis of the combination of the roles is really about how do we create a greater whole by using the influence of discipline and process that's worked in one area, perhaps using that to sort of inculcate the next.
I mean, each of those are like the primary drivers for growth in any organization.
Well, there are organizations that don't see strategy as the lead indicator. They see it as more of a function, more of a planning only type function or transactional only type function. And I think your observation is spot on. It needs to be the gathering of those insights to inform those tactical activities. That is truly strategy. But again, with that forward look to where should we go? Where do we deserve to win? And how we're going to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite oxymoron is strategic planning.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. It actually makes the hair on the back of my neck crawl. And I will tell you for that reason, Ty, I took the word planning out of the title. Planning is an activity. It's informed by strategy. The two are not synonymous.
Exactly right. So with strategy, like the customer gets a vote, your competitors get a vote, and there's no way to plan for what they're going to do.
That's right. That's right.
So we connected, and you've been recognized by Becker's Hospital Review as one of the most trailblazing chief innovation officers. It seems like some of the output your organization has been putting out there in the innovation, you seem to be playing at a systems level in terms of like individual patents, just the sheer volume you're pushing out there. Could you speak to some of that? Because it's just impressive what you're managing.
I can't take credit, Ty. I'll be honest that this is a 160 or so year old institution. It was spawned by, has survived, and will grow through self-directed innovation. So the feedstock was already there. The DNA was already there when it came to being this top 10 research institution, but being relentlessly focused on candidly trying to punch above our weight class. You know, there's a very Cleveland specific, perhaps even a Midwestern sort of chip on the shoulder, golly gee or shucks chip on the shoulder. And so we're always trying to run a little bit harder because we don't have the discretion of what some of our counterparts, peers, and competitors have, say, on the coasts.
Mhm.
And for that reason, we do have to keep the pedal depressed a little bit further. And so it's for that reason that we've created this enablement mechanism to source these opportunities, but then not just be the repository, not just be the CRM for these great opportunities, but to put some wraparound services, some resourcing, people and or money or both, to try to sort of induce a de-risking to see if we can move things downfield.
Very cool. There was one mention I wanted to ask you about of vivid visions.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that? Because sounds compelling to me.
So our observation was that strategy setting at a system level tended to be at an administrative level.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we never lose sight of our patients. Sometimes we sort of lose sight of our providers. And in as much as we can set strategy at a system level in terms of markets we want to enter or business model constructs or strategic partnerships, whether they be other systems or other technology players, what about the providers? What about the areas of clinical care delivery that are actually product that we're selling, if you will? And so we embarked, this is more than a year ago, probably January of last year, upon this so-called vivid vision exercise. We went to our clinical chairs and our chiefs and our prolific inventors within each clinical domain and said, crystal ball, where is your area of expertise? Where's it going to be in 5 years' time? What's the thing that's going to differentiate? Think of where TABA was 5 years before TABA was so common, if you will. And it was sort of this blue sky permissioning. And it wasn't just meant to be an academic exercise. The idea, Ty, was okay, cancer oncology or okay, orthopedics. You've told us, here's the thing that we really suspect is starting to show signal, but is not ready yet. It gave us the opportunity to say, okay, how do we tool for that now? How do we reverse engineer the steps for us to be at the table when that is a thing versus the fast follower or someone that will have to always be, trotting to catch up? And can we begin to put those resources, people, processes, and monies in play to position ourselves for what the future might hold? Now, that sounds pretty simplistic, right? We should always be doing that. I just don't think we do that with enough rigor or fidelity.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like the best way to predict the future is to create it,
It's
right?
to manifest it. That's
Absolutely.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So within that, I guess one is when you said kind of like paying attention to clinicians and providers. One of the biggest recurring themes that I've heard as I've encountered the healthcare landscape has been just the nursing shortfall.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if that's something that you found like emerging solutions to help with that, because you have a bit large number of nurses that had retired as a result of the pandemic. And then also just turnover of once nurses get trained, then, just they start going into it and realizing that maybe not for them. Curious how you see that as a emerging trend.
It's a huge issue. Nurses no one chooses nursing because of the glory and the money. You choose nursing because you have a mission focus and you do want to care for people and you do want to be patient facing and bedside invariably. Of course, we have nurse leaders, nurse administrators, and that's wonderful, but they've come through the ranks. They understand how the cookie is baked, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
We now have, because of either self-inflicted inefficiencies or because of documentation burdens or shortages that you mentioned, we have nurses spending disproportionate amount of time on administrative activities, which takes them away from what it was they were trained to do, what it was they are trained to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, patient-facing care. So what we are trying to do is we're piloting certain technologies to re-elevate nurses back to top of license by putting tech in place to fulfill some of that burden.
Mm-hmm.
All of your listeners, all of you are very aware of all of the ambient listening opportunities that are out there. Those are real. Those are getting perfected. That'll change not just the nurse, but all clinicians, day in the life of. But there are also technologies that act as sitters. You put a technology into a room.
Mm.
It can watch, in quotes, the patient. It can become this two-way portal, this conduit from a communication perspective. It can use algorithms to predict potential fall or risk. It can monitor meds adherence.
Mm-hmm.
And it can also be, and this is the ironic part, because this was the thesis we didn't know that we needed to test, can also become a companion to the patient. And then becomes this sort of this hub of connectivity for the caregiver group, for the families, as well as the caregivers. We experimented with 150 or so rooms. We have a central command at one of our locations that monitors all of these rooms. And suddenly we've alleviated a lot of burden, given a lot of time back to nurses who would have been having to sit and watch, which of course is not top of license.
Sure.
Or we would have had to have hired sitters whose sole role is to perhaps just watch. Again, critically important because there is true quality and risk avoidance implications to that. But why not use tech to do that and put the human back into human roles? The first phase of this pilot, if you will, Ty, was so successful. We're rolling out over the next few months, literally hundreds and hundreds of more beds across different sites and different locations. Carefully, you can't go 0 to 100. But by doing so sort of in a very, very orchestrated concentric circles model, you can continue to test the scalability and the effectiveness at the same time. And pretty encouraged around that. So an example of how we're trying to positively impact, the nursing reality that we face.
And that is the primary metric, is just giving time back to nurses. Because I think like that's one that's like fuzzy as a metric, but it seems like
you'll know it when you see it. Is sort of not something you take to the board, right? You can't put an ROI around that, although innately you believe that to be true. I think it's multifactorial. There's the time element. There's the risk avoidance element, falls and meds, for example. There is the patient experience quotient as well, which of course is critically important. And then there's the experience of the families of the caregivers. Do they feel like they are consistently digitally tethered back to the care team versus having to hope and wait that someone rounds or have to press the button to call someone in? There's a sort of real-time connectivity. I think it's critical.
So maybe take me through a progression. It doesn't have to be that example, but it seems like you're prototyping and building within your ecosystem. And that I'd imagine at some point in time it exports out to other hospitals. Is that okay? So tell me a little bit more about your systems in that regard.
Yeah, in fact, we were on a call this morning with another hospital system a few hours south of us. The sole premise of the conversation is we're all solving for the same thing. You can do it your way. We'll do it our way. We all surmise that there's a huge gray area between the two. Can you imagine the power of doing it together? And not as sort of linear as dual trial sites. That sort of happens all the time. How can two institutions with different pre-intellectual positionings come together to make a greater good? And, there was immediately talk around, well, how do we systematize this and what documentation? We're like, stop. Let's find the one thing. Let's find a thing. Let's do it successfully. And let's use that as the catalyst for the formalization of something a little bit broader. So I think there's some informality inter-system that occurs. And
Hmm.
we have conversations of 20, 30 healthcare systems all the time around things they're seeing, we're seeing, the sharing of diligence, the testimonial exchange. There are some constructs that are a little bit more formal, when you can think of a general catalyst type construct or many others where they are bringing systems together with a very discrete and distinct set of outcomes and measurables. Some are a little bit more opportunistic and organic, like the one I was discussing this morning. So I don't think there's a single pathway to success here at Tide, but critical that we do it and don't think myopically that we can just solve for our own problems anymore.
Right. And just kind of keep it within your own ecosystem. And
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about a couple of different emerging trends, but what are some of the trends you're watching right now for healthcare innovation?
Well, no one would be credible if they came on your show and they didn't mention AI because, this is not fad. This is not fun, but it's not yet at a point, obviously, that it's ready for prime time. So you have to be careful when it comes to the what and where you play in a generative AI, specifically by virtue of issues like harm and risk. So the lowest hanging fruit is always going to be on, again, the administrative burden thing that we mentioned, element that we mentioned earlier. How do you create efficiencies? Not necessarily to adjust headcount. Our premise, our thesis is the right adoption of the right AI elevates people within their roles, doesn't eliminate roles, or enables you to retool people, retrain people, reposition people. Of course, the clinical implications are incredibly exciting. Radiology and imaging were very early adopters of AI for self-evident reasons. But, it no longer needs to be a very capital intensive play either. I mean, this becomes a primary tool within a delivery of healthcare, that of, personal cellular devices. So we've created an intake mechanism, method to sort of adjudicate risk, run the traps from a risk, compliance, and legal perspective, get the overlay of the clinical affirmation that the tool could actually do what it purports to do, and then very gently introduce it into care delivery, never to substitute the role of the physician. This is the companion to. These are at best decision support. Maybe one day that changes, but never the replacement. And of course, you have to put guardrails in place to make sure that these tools are adopted in a support, in a trust but verified type mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The terminology I've heard that kind of encapsulates some of that is human-centered AI.
Right. Exactly. It's not oxymoronish, but
well, right. But you have like it's a false dichotomy of human control versus computer control.
Right.
That's two different dimensions.
That's right.
And you can have full human control and full artificial intelligence interaction to augment, or you could try to take humans out of the loop, which just seems dangerous at some point in time.
That's right. Well, we're not going to allow planes to fly pilotless, and we shouldn't allow, diagnosis to happen doctorless either.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's one of the surefire ways to get dinged by the FDA if you try
Absolutely.
to. Yeah.
That's if the FDA still exists, and which I don't think you might not have the 3 hours remaining on this podcast.
Well, kudos to AbvaMed for getting the FDA employees rehired.
Yes.
That was a very troublesome period of time we're going through right now, but it was good to see that, at least some sanity pushback and guardrails for our systems. Do you want to kind of comment on that? Are you seeing any of the, policy level changes impacting what you're seeing in your system?
Yeah, we're not immune. We're probably just an exemplar. We are all beginning to get our arms around the attempt to quantify the potential implications of which of these pieces of legislation will actually land. And at the worst case, of course, it's draconian. we will candidly be out of business. This is an existential period for healthcare. Access is a huge worry for us. If in fact reimbursement thresholds change dramatically and rural and community hospitals begin to close, where are these patients going to go? How are they going to access care?
Mm-hmm.
Drug discovery, device, regulatory approvals, cures. These things, entities are pencils down right now, Ty, as you know. So we've got to get to some rational level of response in terms of at least keeping the machine fired. But we're not sitting idly. We are delineating and quantifying all of the things that we think we might need to have to do, depending on the size of the reaction that we need to address. Most systems are doing the same. Some systems have huge, endowment pools where they have a different risk tolerance. We find ourselves in a position where doing nothing and hoping is not going to be a strategy. So we do have to position and prepare ourselves. So a worrying time, especially for organizations that have a research focus, have an affiliation with a university or two. And no one has, there's neither the silver bullet or the right answer at this point. Everything is still so nebulous.
And it seems like any university-based system, just that, one change that happened about indirect costs dropped 15%, that's millions of dollars across many, many ecosystems. And usually that's the people at the margins that are most likely going to be impacted.
That's right. Yeah.
We wouldn't be good innovators if we couldn't respond to change. And so finding a way through, I think, is maybe the superpower we bring to the table.
Can't let a good crisis go to waste. Saw how we could effectively and rapidly react to need during COVID, which was like another lifetime ago.
Mm-hmm.
We're sort of gearing ourselves to muster the same type of reaction speed energy. I think everyone was aligned and focused on the same, largely aligned and focused on the same goals during COVID. It'll be a little bit more fractured here this time because the political subplot, I think, is a lot more acute than it was during COVID. COVID, we certainly weren't immune from the politics of, but now it's sort of front and center. So navigating that uncertainty along with the tactical, practical uncertainty of day-to-day care delivery is what we're all beginning to sort of limber up around and get our minds around.
Yeah. Well, okay. So then with that context, then let's say you have an aspiring, like young doctor, young nurse who comes up to you that is wanting to get into innovation. And currently we're ripe for those kinds of opportunities to see a big problem that's emergent and try to respond to that. Do you have any advice you could give them for how to get started? Maybe with their idea, let's say they come to you with the solution to the current morass we're facing. How would you advise them?
I think you've keyed on some verbiage that would really immediately trigger for us some guidance.
Okay.
Don't come to us with solutions. Come to us with very tight, well-articulated problems and a potential pathway to solving. There are tons of solutions, and I know I'm speaking your language, Ty, tons of solutions looking for problems, and we just don't have that time discretion, that patience anymore. So pressure test the veracity of the problem. Is it your problem? Is it a problem for this department? Is it a problem for just our system? Is it a problem for our community and our populations? And of course, there's a place for all of them. But given limited time, bandwidth, and resourcing, we can only focus on those that have potential for true impact. And the time to impact is one of the dependent variables that we would assess as well. So when a young inventor, he or she comes to us with an idea, we really pressure test the problem.
Mm-hmm.
If it's still holding water at that point, and if it's not, the pushback is great. Make these changes. Think about these things that you can do to adjust and augment. But if it does hold water, we then have mechanisms to begin to wrap some enablement around that. Do a little bit of early prototyping. Do a little bit of de-risking. Test the premise around what might adoption or go to market look like. Think about an early business model. understand funding needs or regulatory pathway hurdles, walk it to a de-risk point of understanding that there is a there.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's another opportunity to wrap a different set of resourcing around it. So we love that type of, high quality back of envelope is sort of where we love to live. And, it becomes a child, and we like to get the child off to university one day. So, it's also the patient long game.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Oh, so, I was giving a talk to the tech transfer office here locally yesterday, and it seems like it is a bundle of solutions many times. Intellectual property that has been patented, unique, interesting things. But you're sitting at the spot of full familiarity and living on a day-to-day basis with the most acute problems. So how much of that matchmaking sounds like you don't have time to do that matchmaking on behalf of tech transfer offices?
We have to hold the line when it comes to merely trivial pursuit for academic gain. There is a play and place for incredibly impactful white papers and publications, of course. But if one of the mandates of our platform is sustainable alternate revenue streams, as an example, as well as the facilitation of research, certainly, we have to find those gems that actually do have the opportunity to actually see the light of day and be liberated, commercially liberated. So the bar is actually pretty high. We see hundreds of invention disclosures a year. We used to patent 100% of them, and we just don't do that anymore because that's a bridge to nowhere, as you well know.
Mm-hmm.
Choose a subset that we really think are in need of protection. And then that puts them in a threshold where we can begin the other work that I mentioned around prototyping, etc. But the bar is pretty high. We've created templates and a pathway and an assessment process so that everyone feels heard, and that the feedback, regardless of what that feedback might be, is actionable. So, that's how we've attempted to address what you've asked.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And, of course, with patents, I often like to say that that's not really a signal of market validation.
No, it isn't.
It's purely that you've elected to pay a tax on a monopoly, and it's no value judgment on the idea itself. You could get a patent on, say, like a way to make sure that toilet paper rolls are like the one way versus another.
That's right.
Doesn't necessarily mean people would actually pay for it.
That's right. That's
Yep.
exactly right.
Okay, so I'm very much a bookworm.
Yep.
Do you have a book that you've read recently you might recommend for aspiring entrepreneur or innovator?
Yeah, I have, and it's a book I've read. It's a book I've recently reread because it's a book that I prescribe, if you will, to would-be inventors, to innovators, to wanna-be founders. It's a book actually written by a colleague of mine. His name is Brandon Cornuke, and he wrote a book known as that's titled The Value Proposition Matrix. And it's really this attempt to help inventors, businesses, and startups systemically evaluate and refine their value propositions. It's sort of a very digestible weekend read for anyone that's looking to go from problem to product. It forces the very difficult questions to be asked. And then it calls out those areas where you do perhaps need to go back to the drawing board. And I tell you, it is being so well received by innovators and inventors because it demystifies this process of go to market. And it calls out all of those elements that you really need to have some kind of cogent thought around. You don't have to bat 1,000. If you don't have to have the answer for every element of the matrix, so to speak, but there's a threshold at which you need to have at least enough answers, and then permission yourself to solve for the gap. So, highly recommend Brandon Cornuke's Value Proposition Matrix.
Well, absolutely link to it in the show notes, and I'm going to pick that up a copy. I think that's
excellent.
Very seriously. So thank you for that.
Great.
So I think to close out, how can medical innovators get involved with either connect with you or UH Ventures? What's the best way for people to follow you?
We have a website. If you Google UH Ventures, it'll pop up, and there is an innovators intake.
Okay.
And it's a pretty simple. People populate the various fields to the prompts and the questions. That comes into a central repository, and we have a turnaround time to react to those. Obviously, it's challenging to react to everything immediately, but we do attempt to be appropriately reactive. That's probably the best way to engage with us.
Very good. Okay, we'll make sure we include a link to that.
Great. Excellent.
Okay. David, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Pleasure was mine. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.